Out of, I think it's about 300 songs that John and I wrote together, we never had a dry session.
Dusty Springfield, the velvet seductress of swinging London. In a recent candid sit-down that had fans around the globe raising their eyebrows and leaning in a little closer, Sir Paul McCartney, now 83 and thoroughly beyond the need to play coy, stunned viewers with a revelation no one saw coming. He didn't talk about Abbey Road or John Lennon. Instead, he dove headfirst into a confessional list, teasing with the mischief of a man who's earned the right to blush and not care who sees it. And the very first name he dropped? None other than Dusty Springfield, the iconic British songstress whose beehive hair and eyeliner thicker than royal protocol once made hearts stutter across London. Paul recalled her not just as a voice, but as a presence, the kind that walked into a smoky backstage party and rearranged the molecules in the room. With a smirk and a shrug, he admitted that one hum from Dusty could have made him do cartwheels. Their paths crossed many times during those whirlwind 1960s nights, filled with music, sweat, and potential scandal, but Paul always kept it professional, or at least tried to. He remembered how, despite chatting with someone else the second Dusty appeared, every man's attention, including his, snapped to her like magnets to metal. Her singing, he said, wasn't just music, it was an invitation. Every note dared you to imagine what she sounded like when the lights were off and the curtains drawn. In a moment of classic McCartney honesty, he added, "If she had just crooked her finger, I'd have followed her into the nearest dressing room faster than you could say Eleanor Rigby." With a wink and a boyish grin, Paul confessed he might not have even tuned his bass first. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how a knight of the realm described a singer who, by all accounts, had the power to short-circuit a Beatles' brain with a single look. Cher, the dangerous icon, he couldn't look away from. When Paul McCartney uttered the name Cher, it was less a statement and more of a soft admission, like a schoolboy confessing to a forbidden crush decades too late. The moment her name left his lips, his entire demeanor changed. Eyes twinkled, grin widened, and that unmistakable mix of guilt and awe washed over his face. That woman, he said with a chuckle, was dangerous in the best way. And he didn't mean tabloid scandal dangerous. He meant the kind of danger that waltzes into your subconscious and decides to stay rent-free. Cher, the goddess with midnight hair and a jawline that could cut glass, carried herself like someone who didn't ask for attention. She demanded it by simply existing. Paul admitted he had no defense mechanisms for that kind of energy. She wasn't just magnetic, she was the whole magnet factory. He remembered how, whenever Cher entered a room, everything dimmed around her, like the universe agreed she should be the focal point. "You didn't just look at her, you stared," he confessed, as if he were still under her spell. And in typical cheeky fashion, he added that if she had ever so much as flicked her hair in his direction, he'd have followed her without even grabbing his coat. "One smile and I'd be gone," he laughed, "and I'm not sure I'd ever want to come back." But it wasn't just her beauty. Paul admired her confidence, the way she moved like she'd already read your mind and wasn't the least bit impressed. "I've always gone weak for a woman who doesn't need anyone's approval," he said. It was that self-assuredness, that regal defiance in sequins, that made her utterly irresistible. And while Sir Paul might have been the most famous bass player on the planet, he admitted that in a room alone with Cher, he'd probably forget how to spell Beatle. "She could have had me," he sighed with a grin, "and I'd have thanked her for the trouble." Tina Turner, the firestorm that could burn down a Beatle. When Tina Turner's name entered the conversation, McCartney didn't hesitate. His voice dropped a little, like he was about to tell a secret he'd held in his back pocket for half a century. "Tina Turner," he said slowly, letting the name simmer. Now that was a woman who could set a man on fire without ever laying a finger. The admiration in his voice wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, almost reverent. He described watching her perform with the same intensity as someone recalling their first lightning strike. Sweaty, electric, unforgettable. Paul wasn't just talking about her voice, though that alone could make marble statues weep. It was her command of the stage, her refusal to ask permission, her unapologetic, full-throttle presence. She didn't sing songs, she detonated them. McCartney admitted that standing backstage while Tina tore up the stage was like watching a volcano dance. Equal parts beautiful and terrifying. "She didn't wait for the room," he said. "She took it. And if she wanted you to, well, you didn't get a vote. And then, in true Paul fashion, came the cheeky confession. "If we'd ever been alone in a dressing room," he smirked, "I'd have forgotten every chord I ever knew. She'd start humming that low growl of hers, and I'd be lost in 3 seconds." He didn't even pretend he would have resisted. That's the thing about Tina. According to Paul, she didn't give you a choice. You just gave in. And had she ever crooked her finger at him, there might have been a gaping hole on stage where Paul McCartney was supposed to be. And I wouldn't have regretted it for a second. He laughed. Lulu, the cheeky spark who made him feel 17. Again, if Tina was the firestorm, Lulu was the spark. Small, bright, and mischievously capable of starting a 5-alarm blaze. When her name popped up, Paul couldn't contain his grin. "Lou!" he laughed, shaking his head like a man remembering his teenage self with all the fondness and none of the shame. She was a pocket-sized powerhouse from swinging London, a bundle of energy wrapped in a smile that could knock out traffic lights. Paul didn't describe her with grand statements or epic metaphors. He spoke of her like you talk about that one person who made your heart flutter when they walked into school wearing your favorite band's t-shirt. "She made me feel 17 again," he said, "and believe me, I'd have let her." Their circles overlapped constantly. Parties, BBC variety shows, green rooms filled with too much hairspray and not enough supervision. And though Lulu was younger, Paul made it clear that her presence wasn't something you ignored. She laughed loudly, teased shamelessly, and had a look in her eye that suggested she knew exactly what kind of trouble she could cause, and loved it. You couldn't help but imagine what it'd be like if that giggle got a little more private, Paul confessed, grinning like a man who'd spent a few nights losing sleep over that very thought. He recalled the way she'd catch your eye across a room and smirk like she was challenging you to misbehave. And had she ever leaned in and whispered something suggestive, McCartney admitted he'd have abandoned his tour bus and let the Beatles play a man short. She wasn't just cute, he said. She was cheeky. And that's the kind of danger you don't see coming until it's too late. Barbra Streisand, the diva who could disarm with a note. Barbra Streisand didn't just make the list. She practically owned it. McCartney's tone shifted the moment her name emerged, like he was suddenly talking about royalty. "Barbara," he said, his eyes lighting up like he'd just remembered a dream worth repeating. That woman didn't enter a room. She made the room wish it had dressed better. Unlike the flirty British pop girls of his early years, Streisand had gravity, intelligence, that quiet authority that didn't require theatrics. Paul admitted that if she had walked into Abbey Road mid-session, he might have forgotten his own lyrics. She didn't need to flirt, he explained. She just opened her mouth and that voice came out. And my God, it wasn't singing. It was seduction. In typical McCartney style, he quipped that Barbara could have sung the phone book and still had him weak at the knees by the time she hit the Ds. And if she'd ever leaned over a piano to sing just for him, he might have forgotten how to play his own. But it wasn't just her voice, it was her wit, her razor-sharp humor. Paul admitted he's always been drawn to clever women who could tease you and challenge you in the same breath. If she teases like this in public, he mused, what must she be like in private? It was the kind of dangerous curiosity that keeps men writing love songs for decades. Barbara, he said, was untouchable in all the right ways, which, of course, made her all the more tempting. If she'd ever given me the nod, he said, I'd have been in her hotel room faster than you can say evergreen. Diana Ross, the Supreme. Who could strip you with a smile? Diana Ross wasn't just admired by McCartney, she was practically worshipped. When her name was mentioned, Paul didn't just smile. He looked like a man who had just remembered the most exquisite dream and realized it never quite left him. Diana Ross, he said with a slow grin. Now that woman didn't sing, she hypnotized. Paul's recollection of their brief interactions during the glory days of Motown and Beatlemania were peppered with reverence and a touch of mischief. He described her presence as regal, saying she moved through rooms like she'd levitated past common conversation. And yet when she smiled, everything melted. You forgot your name? He laughed, and didn't really care to get it back. Diana, he said, didn't flirt in the traditional sense. She commanded. She selected. You didn't ask Diana Ross out, you simply hoped to be chosen. And if she ever chose him, Paul admitted, there wasn't a planet he wouldn't have followed her to. He even confessed he used to daydream about her singing not on stage, but softly, privately, just for him. that smoky tone curling around his ears like silk. "I wouldn't have lasted 3 notes," he said. "I'd have melted right into the floor." And if she ever whispered something suggestive in that velvet voice, Sir Paul would have been out of his suit faster than he could strum an E chord. "That's the truth," he nodded, as if sealing the fantasy in memory forever. Janis Joplin, the wild child. He couldn't resist. If the other women on McCartney's list were sparks, flames, or fireworks, Janis Joplin was a full-on rock and roll wildfire. Uncontainable, untamed, and absolutely unforgettable. When her name came up, Paul's voice dipped into that conspiratorial whisper, as if speaking her name too loudly might summon some wild spirit from backstage. "Janis," he said with a shake of his head. "She was chaos in boots, and I wanted every minute of it." Unlike the polished divas and camera-ready icons he'd known, Janis didn't try to be beautiful. She didn't try to be anything. She just was. And that rawness, that lack of pretense, made her the sexiest woman in the room. Paul described her as unpredictable in the best way, someone who might kiss you, cuss you out, and then sing your soul into dust all before you finished your drink. Most singers, he admitted, you knew what you were going to get. With Janis, you didn't have a clue, and that made her all the more hypnotic. Her voice wasn't just music. It was a storm with a broken heart riding shotgun. Watching her perform, he said, was like witnessing a thunderclap in real time. And yes, he confessed to wondering, often, what it might feel like if all that fire was aimed at him. The idea of Janis singing only for him, sweat-drenched and electric, wasn't just tempting. It was borderline spiritual. "If she ever pulled me into a corner," Paul said, "I'd have let her do whatever she wanted, and I'd have come crawling back for more." He didn't speak about Janis like she was a fantasy. He spoke of her like she was a fever he barely survived. "She wasn't the kind you forgot," he sighed. "She was the kind you remembered forever." And in perhaps the cheekiest line of the entire interview, he added, "If she ever called my name, Sir Paul would have dropped the Sir and just been her boy for the night." A Beatle brought to his knees by a bluesy, barefoot hurricane named Janis. The naughty list of a Beatle nightas. The curtain began to fall on Paul's late-life confession. What lingered wasn't just the names, Dusty, Cher, Tina, Lulu, Barbara, Diana, Janis, but the way he spoke about them. Not like a list of lovers, but a lineup of icons who could have rewritten the script of his life with just a glance. There was no bitterness, no longing, just playful honesty and a twinkle that refused to age. McCartney made it clear. He wasn't spilling secrets to stir headlines or manufacture scandal. He was simply a man in his 80s, looking back on a life most people couldn't dream up, and daring to admit the truth behind the tuxedos and ticket sales. These weren't just flirtations. These were the women who made the world tilt a little whenever they entered a room. Paul didn't rank them, didn't compare them. He simply smiled, nodded, and told the world that even a rock legend could get starstruck. "I was a Beatle," he joked, "but around them, I was just another bloke hoping for a miracle." It was a refreshing reminder that behind the fame, the legacy, and the millions of screaming fans, Paul McCartney was also just a man who had secret crushes, daydreams, and those delicious what-if scenarios we all carry through life. It's rare for a legend to peel back the curtain like this. Rarer still to do it with charm, humor, and the cheekiness of someone who still knows how to make the world blush. And blush we did. In a world where celebrities often stick to rehearsed sound bites and safe answers, Paul McCartney's list felt like an act of rebellion, gentle, cheeky, and completely unexpected. He wasn't airing dirty laundry or claiming romantic victories. In fact, most of these women probably had no idea how deeply they'd etched themselves into his memory. But that's what made the confessions so disarming. Here was Sir Paul, a knight, a musical genius, and a cultural icon, admitting that even he had fantasies that never left the green room. And these weren't wild tabloid stories. These were moments frozen in time, made sacred by silence, and now finally shared with the kind of mischief only an 83-year-old heart can get away with. What made the story powerful wasn't the idea that Paul could have had them, it was the idea that he didn't. That even in all his stardom, there were still people who made him nervous, who left him speechless, who made him imagine things that never happened. And somehow, that vulnerability made him more human, more relatable, and ironically, even more legendary. As fans, we often want the myth. But in this rare glimpse, Paul gave us something better. The man behind the myth, playful, honest, and still very much in love with the memory of being starstruck. When asked if he regretted never acting on these secret crushes, Paul didn't hesitate. With that signature smirk that's made generations swoon, he leaned back and delivered the kind of line that belongs on a poster. "I didn't have to touch them to remember them. That's how you know it was real." And there it was, a mic drop from the most romantic Beatle. No scandal, no drama. Just the quiet admission that sometimes the most powerful loves are the ones that stay in the realm of imagination, undisturbed, unspoiled, and deeply cherished. He didn't need a tabloid headline to feel what he felt, and as he grinned, folded his hands, and let the silence speak for him, you could tell these 7 women weren't just names in a story. They were chapters in his soul, and for one fleeting moment, the boy behind the Beatle was standing in front of us, dreamy-eyed, wide open, and still hoping someone might crook a finger his way.